Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Moore. I'm the host of English Language Testing Society's Testing in 10 video interview series. And I'm happy to have Dr. Tahnee Bucher with me today. Tahnee is an assessment developer with a Michigan language assessment and earned her PhD from University of Arizona and is a new transplant to the Midwest where I am. So welcome, Tahnee.
Thank you very much, Eric. My pleasure to be here.
Great to see you again. And let's get into some questions. So first, can you explain your understanding of fairness and bias in language testing, particularly in the context of like both classroom assessment and large-scale language testing?
Sure. So fairness and bias are essential considerations, whether we're talking about classroom assessment or we're talking about as part of large-scale language assessments, right? To me, thinking about fairness and bias is thinking about the consequences of a test, because language tests are used for many purposes in many different contexts, right? And they're often the basis for high-stakes decision-making. So we need to really be thinking about the consequences that a test is going to have, because they can impact a broad range of stakeholders, right? So for me, it's very important to be thinking about fairness and bias as it relates to the consequential validity of a test, right? So it's about promoting equitable assessment processes. And I think for me, the key word is a process. So it's not only thinking about what is fair and what is not biased in, for example, the test development or the test design, but also thinking about administration of the test, thinking about the rubrics or the scoring systems that you're using to score that test. How are you giving feedback to the test taker, right? How are you interpreting the scores? How are you using the scores? So to me, thinking about fairness and bias and promoting equitable assessment is thinking about every stage of the process and making sure that no stage is unfairly disadvantaging anyone, right? Or any group of test taker. So I think it's very important to think, because I feel like a lot of the times we're only focused on the test itself, but we forget the other parts of the process, right? So I think it's really important to think about the consequences and how we're thinking about the meaningfulness of the score, right? We want to think about the consistency of what we're testing, of the scores, the security systems. We're thinking about justice and really respect for the test taker, right? Because I mean, unfair assessments will drive unfair decisions, right? And unfair consequences. And unfortunately, a lot of the decisions that are made about us in the world are based on assessments, right? And so if the assessments are unfair, if the assessments are biased, then the decisions that are going to be made about us are going also to be unfair and biased. So I think it's a really important part of the of validity, of establishing validity of a test, is thinking about those two concepts.
And I've found a lot of times speaking with people that are doing testing, teachers, administrators, et cetera, that they're almost a little scared of this, just like you mentioned, because there's so many aspects and they care about the test takers, the students or the test takers, but they almost feel kind of overwhelmed by this. And a lot of people have a negative feeling themselves about having to take the test, whether it's TOEFL, IELTS, ITEP, any of the tests or the GRE, et cetera. So those are great points. What are some of the key potential sources of bias in language test content?
There's a lot, actually, that we have to be thinking about. And I think it's about doing our best to minimize as much as possible, right? Because there's always going to be something that may happen and then you're not even thinking about it. And this is I think this is one of the things that I've learned a lot is with my work with large scale proficiency testing, is that you try to and also with assessments in general, you fix a problem here, but you may create a problem there. But to answer your question, I think for test content particularly, we're thinking about cultural bias. So for example, including a passage that requires some familiarity, or the test takers that have some familiarity with what the topic is may have more advantage over somebody who doesn't have that familiarity. So we can never assume familiarity with some sort of cultural topic, right? Also in terms of linguistic bias, for example, using a form that is not standard or not usually used, not commonly used in certain or more commonly used in certain dialects and not in others, right? So that can creep in. Gender bias as well that we need to account for. And one way to do that is using more general neutral language, but then we have to think about the things that we are inserting into the test that will, for example, right now, is it, I will give you a concrete example. Right now, is it possible to include pronouns, for example, they and them for a singular, for he or she? Is it possible? Is it something that we would want to do? Yes, but is it possible to do that right now? We have to think about how is English being taught around the world, right? Do people know about this, right? So we want to have that balance. And that's what I'm saying about, like, you fix a problem, but you may create another problem, right? And so we have to really think about the vocabulary that we are using in the test. We're thinking about gender bias, we're thinking about stereotypical biases as well. So there's a lot of things that can creep in the test content and the test design that we have to account for.
That makes a lot of sense. I know so previously working with some students from overseas, and they had asked me about using they for the singular, and they wanted to be very equitable and to make people feel comfortable, classmates or other people they ran into, but they were confused on, do they, I think this one person asked me, do I have to say they is then in this case? And I said, oh, no, but that can be kind of tricky to learn about that.
So we have to we have to be careful with if we want to test this, right? Because is this how English is being taught elsewhere, right? We want to be inclusive, but we also have to keep those things in mind as well, right?
Of course, you don't want to see it for the first time on a test, right?
Exactly.
So how can the process of test administration introduce bias, and what steps can be taken to minimize the potential bias?
So in test administration, so you want to make sure that you have consistent environment, right, for the test. You want to make sure that you have proctors, you have raters that are trained. I think about fairness also in terms of, is it easy to cheat on this test, right? Right. So if it is easy to cheat, then if it's not secure enough, and we're thinking here, I'm thinking take at-home tests, right? When you like, that has been the thing since the pandemic. So security for me is a great issue here in terms of a test being fair or not, right? You don't want, if it's easy to cheat, then what can we say? Is the decision being made fair, right? So I think these are things that we have to be taken into consideration. So training proctors, training raters, making sure the environment of the administration is consistent and it's not distracting for the test taker, thinking about security issues as well. So I think all these factors play a big role in test administration.
Sure. In your experience, how can bias creep into the scoring of language tests? So when a teacher or someone is scoring themselves, how does bias come in? Because we all sort of feel like, or a lot of times people, feel or say, I don't have any bias. I work really hard to eliminate any bias.
Oh, there's a lot of ways that you can try to be as objective as possible. For example, by having good rubrics, right? So that you can be as objective as possible. But there is a lot of ways that bias can creep in. For example, language bias. You're more familiar, like you're a teacher, like you've been a teacher for a long time, then you already expect, you can fill in the blanks for certain errors or certain things that some test takers are more able from this culture or this language background can produce. And so is it really your brain that is filling in the blanks and making you understand that test taker better as opposed to this other test taker that you're not so familiar with their language background, right? So we have to thinking about how our brains are filling in the blanks for how the test takers are responding, or the response that you have in front of you, or if they're talking to you. If they're talking to you, their accent, are you more familiar with one kind of accent and with not the other, right? So when you're grading that test taker whose accent you're not that familiar with, is that affecting your grade of that test taker, right? Non-native speakers versus there has been a lot of research looking at non-native speakers versus native speakers grading of a test, like the kind of things that they pay attention to. So are non-native speakers paying more attention to the test taker's grammar as opposed to native speakers paying attention more to or giving more weight to the communication aspect of it and not really thinking so much about the grammar or the pronunciation of the test taker. So really, there are many ways that we can have bias when it comes to the scoring. But I think the key is to have a good rubric, right, that is as objective as possible, and try to stick to what you have that, and then of course train your raters as much as possible, right, especially if you have multiple raters. Right.
Sounds great. Good. Okay. I think time for one more question. What do you see as the most significant issues or hurdles when we're trying to achieve, get as much fairness and reduce bias in different types of tests, either proficiency, achievement, diagnostics? And what recommendations would you give to test developers and administrators to mitigate these situations and these issues?
I think so. I think the biggest the hurdle would be the unknown. What you think is okay, but in fact may not be okay. So I think also always having many sets of eyes on any given item or any test form, right, is the most important thing to do. And that's one thing that I've learned here by being part of a large scale language testing, and that works also for classroom assessment, is have multiple people look at the items, review the items themselves, right? Have experts and with different backgrounds, because everybody brings something into the testing situation that could improve that particular item. The other thing is to carry out, and I know a lot of teachers don't have the time or the tools to do that, but also carry out item analysis, right? See if the items are functioning the same way for different types of test takers, if there's no bias for language background or maybe gender or maybe age. So it's very important to always be conducting statistical analysis. And there are some easy ones that can be that can be done at the classroom level, right? That wouldn't be the same ones that are done or carried out for large scale language testing, but looking at the results, right? Going back, the teacher, it's important for you to go back to your items and analyze. It's not, I gave this test, forget about this, we have the scores, forget about them, right? Look and go back. And I guess my final point would be, in times of artificial intelligence, right? How I think it's something that we need to be thinking about, how we need to keep the human in the loop, right? That's a phrase that has been said a lot these days. We need to keep the human eyes, because we don't know to what extent we can recreate. AI is very good at generating items from a prototype, but we really want the human spice, right? We really want our eyes and our ability to make things more fair, and then less biased, I guess, for testing. So I think it's something that we really need to be thinking about, equity and fairness and bias, especially at this time. Right.
Oh, sure. And so maybe in this case, the AI, we can employ the AI as more of an assistant and let the human still run everything at this point.
Don't let AI just decide what is biased and what is not biased, right?
Right. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm Dr. Tahnee Bucher of Michigan Language Assessment. A pleasure to have you. I'd like to thank also ITEP for sponsoring this July Testing Intent interview series. Thanks again, Tahnee. A pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure, my honor.